Alright, in this video I want to talk a little bit about white space. We talked about white space before, but we've talked about it in our code, in our markup. White space and markup is very different from what we are going to be talking about in the browser. White space in the browser. So white space can be any color. It doesn't need to just be white. Okay, I just want to set that out there right away. If this background on this page were green, we wouldn't call it green space. We'd still call it white space. White space is just the areas where there's no content. Okay? White space gives our eye a place to rest. It helps to create meaningful separation between one thing and another. And it helps to create visual organization. Okay? So, let's take a look at white space a little bit. Now I'm going to use the A List Apart website as an example, and I'm going to also bring up another one called Internet Zillionaire, which I think is a good, well-designed website for several reasons, and I'm going to talk about those reasons in a little bit. Okay, so A List Apart. I want to first talk about macro white space, M-A-C-R-O, white space. Macro means big or large scale, okay? So large scale white space. That's those big areas of space, the areas in between one column and another, those vertical chunks of space in between one column and another. The big areas of white space that separate one article from another. The big area of white space, for example, underneath this logo of A List Apart, this big column of white space here. Those are macro white space. I actually have a little diagram for you right here that shows you how A List Apart uses macro white space. These red bars are the areas of white space, the macro white space, the big areas of white space. The purpose of macro white space is to keep the page from looking too crowded. If we took out this macro white space in between the columns and had those columns sitting right next to each other, things would be almost touching one another. It would get really crowded, and it would be hard to visually organize things between one chunk of information and another. So we want to give a little bit of breathing room in there. If we take a look at this one, the macro white space is approximately 25 pixels for macro white space. And you'll notice it scales up. It gets bigger every time we zoom in. It doesn't stay at just 25 pixels white space. And we can talk about how that happens a little later on. Okay. Micro white space is the area between characters. So right here, the area between the S and the T, the area between the P and the B. Also, it considers line height, the area between one line and another, okay? That separates one line of text from another. So it's that little area of space in between these two lines. That's micro white space. Micro white space helps to make text more readable, okay? If these lines are too crunched up on top of one another, it becomes hard to read. If the letters are too close to one another or too far apart, things become hard to read. We make associations between things that are next to one another. For example, I make an association between the S and the T, and I recognize that as the st sound. I recognize the relationship between the STOP, and it becomes the word stop. If those letters are too far apart, it ceases to be the word stop. It just becomes four characters that are sitting there on a line if they're too far apart. If they're too close together, they become clumped up and difficult to read. Micro white space up here in the navigation. The micro white space is the area in between one item on the navigation list and another. This space right here. If it becomes too far apart, then we stop making a relationship between one thing and another, and it's no longer looking like a navigation menu, but a whole bunch of disembodied things. They're not one part anymore. They're 6 separate, unique entities, okay? So we want to keep them close enough that they read as a group. But we don't want to have them so close that they're sitting right on top of each other and they become hard to separate. We want them to be their own separate little worlds, but we also want them to be connected visually, okay? And that's what micro whitespace does. It helps to create those relationships between things that are next to one another. So micro whitespace and macro whitespace. We really need to have a good balance of spacing in our page. And this is something that you're going to have to experiment with just a little bit, okay? To get things to look the way you want them to look. I'll just remind you that you want to have a decent amount of space between one line and another. We want to keep it right around one character height distance between one another. So I should be able to fit one letter S that's the same height as this letter S over here in between the top line and the second line. If it becomes closer, it might get a little difficult to read. If it becomes too far apart, then we might not read these as one consistent flow of text. Okay? Let's take a look at Internet Zillionaire for a second. This also makes great use of macro whitespace. They use almost 40 pixels of whitespace in between one column and another, but they balance it out with having the text clumped up a little bit closer together as far as the line spacing goes. The line spacing is that space between one line and another. These ones are closer than the line spacing in a list apart. Okay? So the macro white space are these areas in between the columns, in between the paragraphs, and the micro white space is the area in between the lines.